Chapter 4 of my book is called Accidental Atomic Apocalypse. And this is the scenario that not a small, crude nuclear device. By the way, this is about the size of the Hiroshima bomb. You could fashion something roughly the size, the explosive power, I guess I should say, of the Hiroshima bomb out of something like this. But the nuclear weapons and nuclear warheads and the deployed warheads on nuclear missiles, and again there are roughly 23,000 of them in the world today, most of them are way, way more powerful than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki devices. They are 10 or 100 or 500 times as powerful as the Hiroshima and Nagasaki devices. And it turns out that during the Cold War, and actually, let me say that again. It turns out that during the 65-year history of the nuclear age, we have had several episodes where we came very, very close to having not just one nuclear-tipped missile way more powerful than the Hiroshima device, but 10 or 100 nuclear weapons being launched totally by accident, totally by mistake, totally by computer error. If you read my book, you will see that in 1979, in 1983, and in 1995, on 3 separate occasions, we came within 3 minutes of literally destroying the world by computer error. And it just seems to me self-evident that human beings make mistakes, you know? I mean, errors happen. But when you combine errors with infinitely dangerous technologies, the results can be infinitely catastrophic. I just simply don't think we can keep these things around for another 1 or 3 or 6.5 decades and expect that we will dodge the bullet of accidental atomic apocalypse forever until the end of time. Those 3 episodes are 79, 83, and 95 are only the most glaring. There have been hundreds of other episodes of computer, it's not just computer, but mistakes or situations where the accidental launch of nuclear weapons was a real possibility. And that's a risk that I simply don't think the human race ought to tolerate and can tolerate anymore. But that is only one of the urgent and immediate nuclear dangers. Chapter 5 of my book is called Nuclear Crisis Mismanagement. And this is the scenario that in some kind of a beef, some kind of a political confrontation between one or more nuclear armed actors, there's going to be misjudgments and misunderstandings and miscalculations. And there's going to be a leader, and he's going to be getting advice from 8 sides, and he hasn't slept for 3 days, and maybe his mistress is pissed off at him about something, and that's totally affecting his judgment and his mood. And he's going to begin, I say he, because it probably, not certainly, but it probably will be a he. He will begin to engage in this insidious logic that tensions are rising in confrontation X, and the other side is thinking about launching a nuclear first strike, and so we better launch a nuclear first strike first. And I think it's only a matter of time if we live in a world with nuclear armed nations. There are 9 today, and there may well be many more in the future. I think it's only a matter of time before that kind of situation eventually comes to pass. I told you that in the accidental scenario, the accidental nuclear war scenario, there were 3 episodes where we came just a hair's breadth from destroying ourselves by accident. I think it's fair to say that there have been many potential possible miscalculations like that, but 2 are most paramount. One was in 1962, and I think you know all about it, the Cuban Missile Crisis, so I won't belabor that. The other one is one that I bet not many of you do know about. It's called the Able Archer Crisis in 1983. And let me just quickly tell you about this. And as I do, I ask you to think about it not just as a specific episode, but as a general phenomenon, the kind of thing that may well happen again. Here's the deal. It's the fall of 1983. Soviet and American tensions are pretty high. Leonid Brezhnev has just died a year ago. Ronald Reagan has been president for 3 years. Ronald Reagan was pretty belligerent on the international stage. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and it was one of the points in the Cold War where tensions were higher than they had often been. And so now we get to the fall of 1983, and NATO is doing war games in the fall. Every fall, apparently, back then, NATO would do war games in Western Europe, preparing for the possibility, they said, and I take them at their word, that the Soviets might invade across Western Europe, so we have to engage in these war games. But for some reason, we now know, for about 72 hours, the leaders in the Kremlin assessed the whole state of affairs and the intelligence that they had coming in, and apparently the leaders in the Kremlin concluded for about 72 hours that it wasn't a war game. The leaders in the Kremlin for 3 long days truly believed that we were about to invade them and we were about to launch a nuclear first strike upon them. We weren't. It really was just war games, but they thought we were. So you know what they did for those 3 days? Agonized over whether they should launch a nuclear first strike first. And you know what saved us? It just so happens that the British had a well-placed spy who somehow found his way into the, let me say, metaphorically, the bowels of the Kremlin. And this British spy found out that the Politburo thought that the West was about to launch a nuclear first strike upon them, and he sent a frantic message back to London, and he said, stop the war games, stop the war games. And as soon as that message came back, we did stop the war games. And if that spy hadn't been in the right place in the right time, none of us, literally none of us, might be here today. And again, it seems to me only a matter of time before a situation like that, if we keep these things around, if we base our national security upon these things for decades and decades to come, before some kind of nuclear cataclysm becomes virtually inevitable. So let me do another reading now. This is the opening passage of that chapter 4 that I mentioned, called Accidental Atomic Apocalypse, but I think that the paragraph here really applies to virtually all these scenarios that I'm talking about. So, ready? One of the best book titles of recent years was Lethal Arrogance, Human Fallibility and Dangerous Technologies. It was released in 1999 by Lloyd J. Dumas of the University of Texas. You almost don't need to read the book after seeing that title. You know how it's going to come out in the end. Dumas issues a stark warning about the hubris of believing that we can control anything we can invent. Quote, this is Dumas, "We have vastly more power to affect the physical world than we had even 60 years ago. Yet humans are no less error-prone. The clash between our growing technological power and our enduring fallibility has laid us open to disaster on an unprecedented scale." End quote. This is Tad again now. If we expect imperfect human beings to manage infinitely high-risk technologies, eventually we're going to get infinitely cataclysmic results. So that is my brief rendition. There are other phenomenon and scenarios that we can talk about. If you want, we can talk about nuclear proliferation and what I think the inexorable engine of proliferation, and the likelihood that if we, by we in this sentence, I mean my country, the United States, if we insist on basing our national security on nuclear deterrence for decades and decades to come, it is almost a certainty that other states who currently do not have nuclear weapons will come to the same conclusion, that their national security and their national interests will be served by acquiring a nuclear deterrent to protect themselves, and then a decade or two from now we will have not 9 but 19 or 29 nuclear armed nations. And what do you think the chances are then that we can go decades and decades and decades without a nuclear terror attack, without an accidental launch of nuclear weapons, without a nuclear crisis descending into nuclear war? I simply think that basing our national security on, as I just read, these infinitely dangerous technologies is eventually, and almost certainly, going to lead to infinitely cataclysmic results. Because even, there's a sentence in the book and I never can remember it, but I think it's something like this. Even an extremely improbable event, sorry, let me say it again. Even an extremely improbable event over a long enough period of time becomes virtually inevitable. So that is why I believe we need to get busy abolishing nuclear weapons before they abolish us. Now I would like to just change tasks, change directions a little bit. And I want to ask kind of a basic, simple question. And I hope it doesn't seem like a patronizing question, but I'm asking this especially, Don, because many of the people in this audience are younger than you and me and don't remember the Cold War in the way that you and I do. So my simple question is this: does everybody really understand exactly what nuclear weapons do? I mean, when I was 10 years old, it was like the central thing that we all were learning, but it's not so much since the end of the Cold War. So I would like to remind us all of the things that nuclear weapons do. It seems to me that there are three major things that you all ought to know about nuclear weapons. One is that a nuclear weapon can kill an extremely large number of people in an extremely short period of time. Not only can that destroy New York, but it can do it in a second. A nuclear weapon can destroy a city in a second. A nuclear weapon can kill 10,000 people, 100,000 people. A nuclear weapon with a large enough yield, perhaps, I don't know, size of, with the nuclear core the size of a watermelon, perhaps, instead of the size of an orange, could kill 1 million people. Just like that. The blink of an eye. The snap of a finger. The single beat of a human heart. And one might think that that would be enough. That would be enough of a reason and cause to say, gee, is there no other thing we can come up with to protect our national security than weapons of that horrific power? But it turns out that that is not the only thing that nuclear weapons do. Nuclear weapons, and I think you all know something about this, also, besides killing all those people just like that, nuclear weapons also give out this thing called radioactivity. It's both in the form of actual, I guess it's like rays, gamma rays, and beta rays that can, if it doesn't kill people right away, several miles away, these rays can infect is the wrong word, can contaminate and poison people. And it actually, and this is something I didn't understand until I really started studying this, it's both, again, these rays, for lack of a better term, I'm not much of a scientist, but it's also radioactive fallout, and that is actually dirt and dust and debris. If the atom bomb goes off, let's say over Grant's tomb, all of Ihouse and all of us are converted into radioactive dust. The matter doesn't go away. And it gets cast up into the air, dozens, perhaps even hundreds of miles, and then, depending on the prevailing wind, can travel dozens or hundreds of miles and rain down on victims far, far away from the actual point of the nuclear detonation, like a very fine atomic fairy dust sprinkled upon us all. Now, it turns out, I think most of you know this, that nuclear weapons have only been actually used in anger twice in human history, on August 6th and August 9th, 1945, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm about to say bringing about the end of the Second World War, but that's somewhat of a debatable point. But that's not the topic of my book. Nuclear weapons have only been used twice in anger, in August of 1945. But we have a lot of other evidence about this radioactive fallout. Why? Because in the 1950s and the 1960s, primarily the United States and the Soviet Union, later Britain and France as well, conducted hundreds and hundreds, I think more than 1,000 it all ended up at, of above-ground nuclear tests. Of course, they tried to clear out there. Many were done in the middle of Kazakhstan. Many were done in the desert in Nevada. Many were done out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And of course, they tried to clear out all the people for dozens of miles from the area so no one would die from the detonation. And to my knowledge, they were always successful at that, but they were not always successful at judging the wind and judging what would happen to this radioactive fallout. I guess that's why they called it testing, because they were trying to figure out what would happen. So I want to share with you something about radioactive fallout. And Shannon Bishop, right? I've asked Shannon Bishop, who I met an hour ago or so ago, and she and a number of other house residents took me graciously to dinner, and I got my sandwich there that I'm going to eat after I'm done. I've asked Shannon to come up and read a passage to you about this. This is the testimony of a woman who was who was a little girl living on the South Pacific in, I think I have this right, 1954. Find your page, 215, right, Shannon? Yes. Who was an 8-year-old girl living on the South Pacific Island when the Bravo hydrogen bomb test took place several hundred miles away. And years later, this woman, Lijan Eknalan, testified about the effect that the Bravo hydrogen bomb test had on her community and the effect that it had on her. Shannon?
I was 8 years old at the time of the Bravo test on Bikini in 1954. I woke up with a bright light in my eyes. There was a huge, brilliant light that consumed the sky. Soon after, we heard a big, loud noise and the earth started to sway and sink. A little later, it began to snow in Rongelap. We had heard about snow from the missionaries, but this was the first time we saw white particles fall from the sky. We kids were playing in the powder, but later everyone was sick and we couldn't do anything. My own health had suffered as a result of radiation poisoning. I cannot have children. I have had 7 miscarriages. One was severely deformed. It had only one eye. Many of my friends keep quiet about the strange births they had. They gave birth not to children, as we like to think of them, but to things we could only describe as octopuses, apples, turtles, and other things in our own experience. The most common have been jellyfish babies. These babies are born with no bones in their bodies and with transparent skin. We can see their brains and their hearts beating. There are no legs, no arms, no heads, no nothing.
My country did that to those women in the name of my national security. My parents actually have a gray hair, but are not quite that old. Shannon, thank you very much for sharing with us that excruciating testimony. And here it is, what did we say, 1954? So here it is 57 years later, and our country still has a doctrine that threatens to do that. That's what nuclear deterrence is. Nuclear deterrence says, don't mess with us or we will retaliate with nuclear weapons and rain down radioactive fallout on millions and millions of 8-year-old girls.